Welcome, everybody. So my name is Amaury Tillemont. I'm professor in the Department of Water and Civil Engineering at Laval University in Quebec City, Canada. I would like to come back to some of the concepts or issues that Claudia mentioned. She said at one point that water should be considered as an economic good. She also said that we need to manage water more efficiently. In other words, we need to do more with what we have. And to achieve that goal, she mentioned that there were different responses that we could think of. She mentioned supply augmentation, she mentioned conservation, and she also talked about allocation. Now, with those hydroeconomic models, we can assess the hydrologic and economic impact of those responses, of those interventions. But before we look at that, I would like first to clarify some concepts that we usually use in hydroeconomic modeling, and more specifically, some economic concepts. Good. So the economic concept I'm going to talk about are first water supply, then we're going to look at water demand, and then using supply and demand, we're going to look at how we can allocate water efficiently between two different users. I'm going to take a very simple example. And then from these basic concepts, we're going to dive into more realistic hydroeconomic models and look how we build a network representation of the water resource system and what are the modeling approaches that we can use to solve the water resource management problem. But let's first go back to some characteristics of water from an economic point of view. So water is a natural resource like oil, like forest, like minerals. But unlike these resources, water is fugitive. It's a resource that keeps moving. And it moves through the water cycle. So much of the fresh water that we use comes from lakes, rivers, or aquifers. And the water in those lakes, rivers, and aquifers, it keeps moving. Because the water is moving, it makes it very difficult to manage, because typically it creates what we call an asymmetrical relationship between upstream and downstream users. So let's have a look at this schematization here. We have a river flowing like this from top to bottom. Upstream, we have a user, and downstream, we have also a user. Now, if a management decision is taken by the upstream user, like, for instance, diverting water out of the river, this management decision will have impact on the downstream user. But the opposite is not true. If a downstream user takes the water out of the river, there's going to be no impact on the upstream user. That's one difficulty that we are dealing with when we look at water resource allocation problem. So, second thing I would like to insist is the distinction that we have to make between in-stream users and upstream users. Claudia already mentioned in-stream users are users that are made directly in the river, like navigation, fisheries. Upstream users are most of the industrial and municipal users. Irrigated agriculture is also upstream. And second distinction is the difference between consumptive and non-consumptive uses. So consumptive use are a little bit more difficult to handle because they reduce the availability of water in the river basin. Typically, irrigated agriculture is a consumptive use. Water is lost through evapotranspiration. This water is no longer available for downstream users. Non-consumptive use they do not diminish, they do not reduce the availability of water downstream. For example, navigation or fisheries, or to a certain extent, hydropower generation, if I ignore the evaporation losses on the lake, in the reservoir. These are examples of non-consumptive use. So these are less controversial. These are less susceptible to conflict. Another characteristic is that water is what we call a low-value commodity. So Claudia mentioned that water has a value, but in the majority of cases, the value of water is relatively low. And for instance, in irrigated agriculture, which is by far the largest water user on Earth, the value of water is only about $5 per 1,000 cubic meter. This is really small. Now, this is for irrigated agriculture. Now, if we look at bottled water, then the value is much higher. Let's say if you buy a bottle of water, 1 liter in a grocery store, it's going to cost you something like $1. So in this case, it's going to be $1,000 per cubic meter. So the orders of magnitudes are completely different depending on the type of use. But for low-end use like irrigated agriculture, the value is really low. Now, having said that, let's have a look first at some key economic concepts regarding water supply. We are interested to know how water users get their water. In most of the cases, the water users, they need some infrastructure to get the water. They need a pump, they need a canal or a pipe to get the water. Depending on the user, that water can be treated or not. So for household, it's going to be treated water. But for irrigated agriculture or hydropower generation, we're going to talk about bulk water, non-treated. Now, to get this water, it's usually costly. You don't get water for free, and you have to invest into a hydraulic infrastructure, and then you have to face regular expenses for the operation and maintenance of those infrastructures. So it's costly. It costs money to get water. Now, in terms of cost, we have on this graph, on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis, we have the number of units that are being produced. I'm talking about units of water, cubic meter, for instance. And then on the y-axis, I have the cost, the supply cost. So we can see that even if we don't produce any unit of water, we are already facing what we call the fixed cost. The fixed costs are independent of the amount of water that I'm going to use. This is typically the capital cost, the investment cost that are needed to produce the water. So then on top of that, we have what we call the variable cost, VC. Here, the costs vary according to the amount of water that I'm going to use. And now we have here the total cost in blue, which is the sum of the fixed cost and the variable cost. And we can see that the total cost, first, it increases with the number of units that I'm going to produce. There's no way around it. The more you produce water, the costlier it's going to be. But we can see that we don't have a straight line. First, we see that the cost increase is going down. I start producing from zero. You can see that the cost is still increasing, but it increases less and less rapidly until you reach an inflection point here, where suddenly the costs start increasing again more and more rapidly. Why is that so? Well, is that so because usually when you invest in a pump or you build a canal or a distribution network, you do that for a certain capacity. If you don't produce enough water, you are not very efficient and your costs increase rapidly. If on the other extreme, you are producing too much water for the design of your infrastructure, your costs start increasing again rapidly. So from an economic perspective, if you just look at cost, the optimal number of units that you should produce should be around the inflection point, where the unit cost is the lowest. So that's a key aspect for the supply of water to different users, is this notion of total cost. It increases, but it does not increase at the same rate. It depends on the number of units that you are going to use. Now, next to that concept of supply cost, we have the concept of water demand, what Claudia called in her presentation marginal benefit. The water demand, it's in economics a relationship between the value of water, P, and the number of units of water that I'm going to use. And the water demand is decreasing with the number of units that I'm going to use. Why is that so? Well, imagine that your household didn't get water for a few hours because there was a break in the distribution system, and then you start getting water again. You are going to use that water, the first unit of water that you're gonna get, you are going to use them for what we call high-end uses. In a household, high-end uses are typically cooking, drinking. Okay? So then, as the number of units increase, because more and more water is available, you're going to use that water for what we call low-end uses. And in a household, low-end uses are typically activities like gardening or car washing. These are uses that have a low value, whereas high-end uses, each unit has a very high value. So this is what we have in a household, but we can have the same way of thinking for example, for water demand for a hydropower company. If the hydrologic conditions are dry, you don't have much water this year, you're going to use your hydropower plant when the electricity prices are high. And you're going to shut it down when the electricity prices are low. But as the number of, if the number of available water, the number of units of available water increases, then you're going to start producing more and more, and you're going to start producing when the electricity prices are going down. Consequently, you have, again, a decreasing demand curve for water in hydropower generation. In irrigated agriculture, it's a bit similar. If there is rationing, you're going to put the first unit of water on the most productive crops, those that are more valuable to you, and you're not going to irrigate the low end users, the non-cash crops. So a key aspect here is that water demand is a relationship between the value of the water and the number of units that I'm going to use. And this relationship is decreasing. So the more I'm using water, the less valuable it becomes. So why do we use those water demands? Well, if we have engineers in the group, engineers are used to work with water need or water requirements. A water need and a water requirement are binary things. It's all or nothing. Here, I have a water need. If I'm beyond this threshold, then I'm going to be happy. If I cannot supply that amount of water, then I'm going to be not happy. So it's binary. It's extremely restricted. Whereas with the water demand, I have much more flexibility because I'm looking at, for each quantity, I can get the value attached to it. And so I'm not going to try always to meet that requirement, because actually there's no requirement in the water demand. It's much more flexible. It offers much more alternative compared to the water need. So how do we get the water demand? Well, for most industrial uses, the water demands are actually derived from what we call production functions. A production function gives you a relationship between the output of your industrial process as a function of all sorts of inputs and, of course, water in our case. So let's have a look at a very simple example of a production function for hydroelectricity. Now, the production of hydroelectricity, it depends on the flow through the turbines, here, R, here, and it also depends on the difference between the water level upstream and downstream, H. So, this is the production function for hydroelectricity. P is the power, R is the release through the turbines, and H is the difference between the water levels upstream and downstream. So R is the amount of water that I'm going to use. So from this relationship, I can derive the water demand for hydroelectricity. I need to process also other information like the energy prices, etc. But basically, this is an example of a production function, and we can easily get production functions, for instance, in irrigated agriculture. For most industrial process, there are production functions that link the output as a function of the input and water. So for instance, in irrigated agriculture, the output will be some crop yield, for instance, and the input could be seeds, could be fertilizers, labor, and of course, water. So, yeah, I've already mentioned this. Now, we have two fundamental economic concepts: the supply of water and the demand for water. Now, using this concept, we can allocate water efficiently between different users. So from these two concepts, we can allocate water efficiently. Now, I'm not gonna dive into technical details here. I would like to illustrate this concept of economic efficiency using a very simple allocation problems between two users, users A and user B. So these two users pump the water from the same river, which flows from upstream to downstreams like that, from the top to the bottom of the stream. I'm going to make an assumption that the supply cost is zero. It's just to simplify a little bit the process. I have the water demand for user A, and I have the water demand for user B. So I can see that user A, he wants to use up to 4 units of water, and it's the same for user B. He wants to use up to 4 units of water as well. Now, the first unit of water, the value for user A is 10. The second unit of water for user A is 5. The third unit has a value of 2, and the fourth unit has a value of 1. For user B, it's a bit different. The first unit has a value of 8. The second unit has a value of 4. And then the third and fourth unit have a value of 3. First question here, we have a very simple system. What are the allocation decisions? What are the alternatives that I need to determine? Well, I need to determine the amount of water that I'm going to give to user A, the amount of water that I'm going to give to user B, which is WB, and then I have also the amount of water that I'm going to leave in the river and that's going to flow downstream. Now, imagine that there is no water in the river, it's completely dry, and then my hydrologist colleague tells me that 1 unit will be available soon. My question is, okay, what should be the economically efficient allocation decision if there's only 1 unit of water in the system? So if there's only 1 unit of water flowing from upstream up to that point where we have the abstraction points. Well, if we want to be economically efficient, we should give this unit of water to the user, the most productive user. And in this case, the most productive user is user A, because the first unit of water for user A has a value of 10. For user B, it has a value of only 8. So it looks like it's more interesting to give that water to user A. Good. Now, my hydrologic forecaster tells me, okay, no, he was wrong. There's going to be 2 units available upstream. Good. So What should we do with that second unit of water? Because we already allocated the first one. So now we need to think about the second one. Same way of thinking. We look at the value of that unit. If I give that unit to user B, it's going to have a value of 8. If I choose to give it to user B, if I choose to give it to user B, it has a value of 8. If I choose to give that unit to user A, it's going to have a value of 5. And if I leave it downstream, it's going to have a value of 0. So not very interesting. So if I compare 8 compared to 5, obviously it's more interesting to give that unit to B, like this. And I can continue like this. I have 3 units of water available. Same way of thinking. I compare the value of water for the last unit. That's what we call the marginal value of water. And I found out that the best thing to do is to give it to user A, like this, etc. If I have 4 units, I'm going to compare 4 for user B to only 2 to user A, and so I give it to user B. And so I can summarize this with this table. In the first column, I had the number of units available upstream. So I started with 1 unit available, and I gave it to user A, sorry. So that means that user B, and user B did not get anything, and there was nothing left for downstream. We just saw that if there were 2 units available, the first one would be given to A, and the second one would be given to B. I continue like this, and I arrive at 8. If there are 8 units of water available in the system, I would give 4 units to user A, 4 units to user B, because that's what they demand. Okay, that's the total water demand for both users. Now, if I have 9 units available, A and B are fully happy. They get all the water they want, and so there's water left for downstream. There's an outflow. Okay? So now, with this principle, I can see that for different units available, I have the optimal combination of allocation decisions. So if there were 3 units available, for instance, so dry year, we need to start rationing. If I want to have an economically efficient rationing, I would give 2 units to A and only 1 unit to B. So based on this economically efficient principle, that would be the optimal allocation decisions in that very simple system. Problem. When we work with real river basins and real water resource systems, the level of complexity is much higher. There are many more users, there are many more supplies. So to capture this complexity, the first thing we need to do is to build what we call a network representation of the water resource system. With this network representation, we are going to connect spatially distributed water demand to spatially distributed water supplies. So this is a very important step because we need to do that with the different stakeholders, with the different water users, to make sure that the main uses of water are represented, are captured in the network, and we need to make sure that we have all the supplies also represented in the network. So that's why on this small diagram here, you see people around the table discussing the different aspects of their water resource system. And step by step, we can build a network, and the network here would look like this. We would have, let's say, an irrigation scheme here. We have a water supply production plant here. We have a pumping station here, and then the blue dots represent different water supplies, different tributaries of the main rivers. So the triangle are typically reservoirs, and then we have the black arrows. They constitute the arcs that connect the different nodes of the network, and the nodes here could be confluence, could be water demand, could be diversion points, etc. So this is a schematic representation of that water resource system that we see on this picture. This is a schematic representation that captures the different water demands and the different water supplies and how they are connected to each other. And it's important to do that because, as I mentioned earlier, water is flowing, water keeps moving. So we cannot put all the demands together. We need to take into account the fact that they are not located at the same place and connected to the same water supply. So this network representation is a very, very important step when we build a hydroeconomic model. And through this network, we can capture the different water use and the different water supplies and different water resources. And let's have a look at a real example that we used fairly recently. This is the schematization of the Senegal River Basin in West Africa. So the water is flowing in that direction, and it discharges into the Atlantic Ocean on the left. So each triangle is a reservoir. The white one are existing reservoirs, and the red and blue ones are reservoirs in a planning stage. The small squares are hydropower plants. Then this fancy symbol here are irrigation schemes with different crops. Those banded arrows here represent natural inflows. That's how the network is being supplied with water, with runoff, river discharge, natural river discharge. So in this system, the level of complexity is fairly high because there are up to 10 reservoirs. There are many irrigation schemes, up to 52 crops. So at each time step, you need to identify a lot of decisions. You want to allocate water efficiently in that system. So we already mentioned water diversion. So water diversion will be used to supply irrigation schemes, industrial use, and municipal use as well. Now, because we have reservoirs, we have another type of decisions. We need to find a balance between, okay, should we keep water in storage, or should we release it for downstream use or for hydroelectric production? So we have at each time step, we need to know how much water we are going to store in the reservoir, in all of them. We need to know how much water will be diverted or at each irrigation scheme to supply the different crops. And so this problem is is much more complex, but we can still use those hydroeconomic models to solve them and to understand the hydrologic impact, but also the economic impact of different allocation decisions, different policies, or different infrastructural development of the basin. So once we have a network representation of the water resource system, like the one I just showed you, once we have the supply cost and the water demands for all users, we can combine this together and try to solve the allocation problem. And there are basically two main modeling approaches to solve that allocation problem. As Claudia mentioned, we can rely on simulation, or we can rely on optimization, mathematical optimization. So what are the differences and what are the similarities between both? Both are going to use the same representation of the water resource system. So that's not going to change. Most of the time, the inputs are going to be the same. And in our case, the input will be, for instance, the water demands at each irrigation scheme here. The inputs could be the natural inflows, supply water to the network. Then the main difference comes from the fact that with a simulation model, you need to specify the operating policy, for instance. You need to specify, okay, how the reservoirs will be operated. What is the storage level that you want to reach at the end of each period, for instance? How water will be diverted from to that irrigation scheme, depending on the amount of water flowing in the river at that point. These are examples of operating policies. With a simulation approach, you need to specify the operating policy. Whereas with an optimization approach, the optimization model will give you the optimal operating policy. The system outputs are going to be the same. And what are going to be the system output? For instance, we're going to have river flows throughout the entire network. We're going to have power production for each hydropower plant at each time step. We're going to have irrigation or crop production for each irrigation scheme. From this kind of output, we can assess the performance of the water resource system in terms of energy, in terms of agricultural production, could be in terms of navigation, fisheries, industrial use, etc. So simulation, they are very powerful because you can include a lot of details in your network and in your model. The problem is that you need to specify the operating policy, and you are not sure that your operating policy is optimal. So that means that if you want to find an optimal operating policy, you're going to do a lot of trial and error in order to find the best set of optimal operating policies. That's an issue. With optimization, the optimization will give you the optimal operating policy. It's going to be efficient. But on the other hand, you won't be able to specify as many details as you can with the simulation. So to summarize, simulation tools are descriptive. They answer questions like, what if? What if I change my input? What if I change my operating policy? Whereas optimization are what we call in economics prescriptive. They tell you what should be the optimal operating policy, what should be the system output if I change a little bit the system input. For instance, what happens if I change the input like the river discharge because due to climate change? Then I can get automatically the impact of climate change on my output, like on the performance of my system in terms of energy, in terms of food production, navigation, etc. Now, ideally, in an ideal world, what we would do, we would use the same database, and we would do first an optimization to identify the optimal operating policies or the most interesting ones. And then we would simulate in more detail those optimal operating policies in order to get all the performance indicators that we need. Now, there are several softwares available out there. They are commercialized by different companies. For instance, you have Mike Basin, commercialized by DHI, Ribasim, commercialized by Deltares, which is now, that's a former Delta Hydraulics, WEEP by the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and ECRESIM by the US Army Corps of Engineers. Those softwares, they have a user-friendly interface. They are fairly easy to use, and they allow you to build the network, the schematization of the system. And this is, for example, the Senegal River Basin in WEEP, where you have the main river network, and the small red dot that you see on the screen are the main irrigation schemes. And then you also have all over the place reservoirs and hydropower plants that are taken into account. There's also municipal and industrial municipal uses along the river, noted as demand curve. And so using the object that you have here, you can drag and drop them on the map and build your network step by step in order to cover the entire river basin. Thank you.